You could smell the gasoline and popcorn at the drive-in in 1959. The sun was setting over the parking lot, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, and everywhere you looked, gleaming chrome caught the fading light like 1,000 tiny fires. A family pulled up in their Cadillac Eldorado, and even before the engine shut off, the car spoke. Its 225-inch length stretched across 3 parking spaces. Its massive chrome bumpers glowed, but it was what rose from the rear fender that made everyone turn their heads. Twin fins, sharp as daggers, reaching 45 inches toward the heavens. They looked less like a car and more like a sleek, predatory rocket that had landed on 4 wheels. A boy pressed his face against the glass of the diner, his hamburger forgotten, his eyes fixed on those fins. His father smiled. He knew exactly what the boy was thinking. That's the future, he was thinking. That's what dreams look like. But few remember what made those nights truly magical, or what had to happen in the design studios of Detroit to put that dream on the street. The year was 1939. Somewhere above the flat industrial landscape of Michigan, the United States Army Air Corps was testing a new fighter plane. It wasn't like anything that had taken to the skies before. The Lockheed P-38 Lightning was a twin-engine interceptor, a marvel of aeronautical engineering. It had a distinctive silhouette, 2 long booms stretching back from the wings, each crowned with a vertical tail fin, separated by the narrow fuselage containing the cockpit and the pilot who would fly this mechanical beast into the clouds. At General Motors, a man named Harley Earl was watching. Earl was more than just an automobile designer. He was a visionary, a man who understood that cars were more than machines. They were canvas. They were poetry. They were the visible embodiment of how a nation saw itself. When World War II ended and the 1948 model year approached, Earl made a decision that would ripple through the entire American automotive industry for the next 2 decades. He would borrow something from the sky and bring it down to the street. The inspiration went directly to Frank Hershey, one of Earl's most talented stylists. Hershey had been there at Selfridge Field with Earl, watching that P-38 cut through the air. The twin tail, the long lines, the sense of unbroken speed, all of it had burned itself into his imagination. When the UAW strike of 1945 forced GM to relocate its design studios, Hershey invited the Cadillac team to work at his farmhouse 15 miles outside of Detroit. In that informal setting, away from the weight of corporate bureaucracy, something revolutionary was born. The 1948 Cadillac would be the first production automobile to feature tail fins. They were modest compared to what would come later, barely noticeable bumps on the rear fender, but they were there. And when Harley Earl first saw them on a full-size clay model, he ordered them removed. He called them absurd. He threatened to fire Frank Hershey if they remained. Then something unexpected happened. Alfred P. Sloan, the president of General Motors, saw the car. So did Charlie Wilson, the company chairman. They didn't see a design mistake. They saw the future. They liked the fins. They liked them so much that when Earl returned to the studio 2 days later, ready to take the axe to Hershey's work, he instead asked a simple question: "Have you removed the fins yet?" When Hershey cautiously said no, Earl didn't explode. He breathed a sigh of relief and told him to keep them on. In that moment, the entire trajectory of American automotive design shifted. When the 1948 Cadillac rolled onto American roads, the nation had just emerged from the devastation of war. The Great Depression was a fading memory. Soldiers had come home. Families had money in their pockets for the first time in a generation. The suburbs were being born, row after row of identical new houses spreading out from the cores of industrial cities. America was moving forward. America was young. America was fast. But here's the thing about tail fins that most people don't understand. They weren't about aerodynamics. They weren't about function. They were about desire. They were about telling a story. Every time someone saw a Cadillac with those fins, they saw speed incarnate, even parked in a driveway. They saw the future, even on a city street. They saw freedom, the ability to go anywhere, do anything, be anyone. In the 1950s, that message resonated like nothing else. The decade was obsessed with speed and space. In 1947, Chuck Yeager broke the sound barrier. In 1952, the de Havilland Comet became the world's first commercial jet airliner, and suddenly ordinary people could imagine flying to Paris for dinner. Fighter jets were breaking altitude records, missiles were being tested, and in 1957, when the Soviet Union launched Sputnik into orbit, Americans looked up at the night sky and realized they were losing a race they didn't even know they were running. The automobile industry seized on this cultural moment. If Americans couldn't go to space, they could at least drive like they were trying to get there. The tail fins grew taller, sharper, more pronounced. Chrome multiplied across every surface: bumpers, trim lines, grills, even the bezels around windows. The colors became bolder. Two-tone paint schemes became three-tone. Cars became less like machines and more like chrome jewelry, rolling symbols of a nation's obsession with modernity, power, and the glorious future that seemed just within reach. If the tail fin was the spark, then what followed was an inferno. By the middle of the 1950s, American automobile design had become something no one quite expected, a competitive battleground where styling mattered as much as horsepower, where design decisions made in closed-door meetings would determine which car ruled the roads. General Motors, led by Harley Earl's design division, had a head start. The Cadillac had established itself as the standard-bearer for luxury and style. But GM was not alone in the market. Ford had its Thunderbird, a sleek personal luxury car that combined elegance with performance. And then there was Chrysler Corporation, led by a designer named Virgil Exner, a man who would prove to be Harley Earl's great rival. Virgil Exner had a vision he called the forward look. It wasn't just about fins. It was about reimagining what a car could be. In 1955, Chrysler launched a stunning redesign that made competing cars look suddenly dated. The 1955 Chrysler and its corporate cousins from Dodge and Plymouth featured long hoods, short decks, and a sleekness that seemed to suggest movement even when the car was standing still. When Exner introduced his own versions of tail fins in 1957, sharper, more angular, more aggressive than anything GM had done, the battle was officially on. The competition between Earl and Exner was more than professional rivalry. It was personal. Years earlier, Exner had worked for the industrial designer Raymond Loewy, and that relationship had ended bitterly. Now, with the backing of Chrysler's corporate structure, Exner had a chance to prove himself the greater designer. And for a moment, it seemed he might be right. When GM spied on Chrysler's 1957 designs through a fence and realized what was coming, they panicked. According to design history, this espionage prompted General Motors to reopen the designs for the 1959 models and create entirely new versions for every car line, from Chevrolet all the way up to Cadillac. GM was not going to be outdesigned. By 1959, the tail fin war had reached its peak fever. This was the year that would define the entire era, the year when restraint was abandoned and ambition soared. Three American automakers, General Motors, Chrysler Corporation, and Ford Motor Company, were no longer just building cars. They were building statements, they were building dreams, and they were all betting their futures on the same bet: that Americans wanted cars that looked like they'd just landed from another planet. Harley Earl had one last great masterpiece in him. The 1959 Cadillac lineup, and especially the Eldorado, represented the absolute apex of his vision for what an American luxury car could be. These were not subtle vehicles. A standard 1959 Cadillac was already massive, 225 inches long, over 80 inches wide, and weighing nearly 5,000 pounds. They were longer than modern limousines. They were wider than most living rooms. They dominated the road not just through speed, but through sheer presence. But the fins. Oh, the fins. They reached 45 inches into the air, nearly 4 feet tall on some models. They were sharp as knives, with dual bullet-shaped taillights positioned vertically like jet exhausts, complete with chrome bezels that made them look like the burners of a rocket engine. The entire rear end of the car looked like the tail section of a fighter jet or a spaceship. When you sat in the parking lot of a 1959 Cadillac Eldorado, you weren't just parked, you were docked. You had landed. The Eldorado, the most exclusive Cadillac, took all of this to another level, entirely. Starting at $7,500, more than twice the price of a Chevrolet, in an era when that difference meant something significant, the Eldorado convertible was purchased only by those who could afford to make a statement. The convertible top was power-operated. The interior was trimmed in leather and fine fabrics. The trunk held more space than some studio apartments. And under the hood, the optional engine, a 6.4-liter V8 with 3 carburetors, produced 345 horsepower and 435 pounds of torque. But what people remembered wasn't the engine. What people remembered were those fins. In a parking lot full of 1959 Cadillacs, the Eldorado stood out not because of its interior luxury or its mechanical sophistication, but because it looked like it was in motion even when it was parked. The fins seemed to sweep back as if the car was traveling at incredible speed while sitting perfectly still. Meanwhile, Virgil Exner and Chrysler Corporation were pushing their own vision. The 1959 Imperial, the 1959 Plymouth Fury, and other Chrysler products featured fins that were perhaps less tall than the Cadillacs, but equally dramatic in their execution. Chrysler's fins were more angular, more architectural. They looked less like something borrowed from nature or aviation, and more like something designed by a futurist architect. They pointed outward and backward simultaneously, seeming to carve the air itself. Ford, not to be outdone, also pushed its own design agenda. The 1959 Ford Fairlane and other full-size Ford products featured fins that were perhaps more restrained than those of their competitors, but still unmistakably of the jet age. Ford's fins looked practical, purposeful, almost like functional stabilizers rather than pure style. But here's the thing about 1959 that no one in Detroit quite realized at the time. This was the peak. This was the moment when automotive excess had reached its absolute zenith, the point where the pendulum had swung as far as it could go. The tail fins would never be taller. The chrome would never be more abundant. The sense of wild, unchecked optimism about the future would never be more complete. Creating these fins was no simple task. They weren't just cosmetic additions, they had to be engineered into the car's structure. The design process for a 1959 Cadillac began years earlier, with dozens of clay models being created, studied, refined, and discarded. These clay models sat in private design studios under armed guard because the designs were trade secrets worth millions. The body lines had to be perfect. The fins had to be shaped so that the chrome trim caught light in exactly the right way. The dual taillights had to be positioned so that they looked like jet exhausts, and when illuminated, they had to create the impression of thrust, of power, of energy being released. The engineers who worked on these cars were extraordinary. They had to solve problems that had never existed before. How do you make a fin rigid enough that it won't break in an accident, but flexible enough that it can handle the stresses of highway driving? How do you run electrical wiring up into the fin to power the taillights and backup lights without compromising structural integrity? How do you make a car 225 inches long handle in traffic without becoming impossible to maneuver? The answer was innovation. Cadillac's engineers pioneered new manufacturing techniques. They worked with new materials and new structural concepts. The 1959 Cadillac Eldorado featured advanced suspension technology, optional air suspension with gas-filled shock absorbers for an unprecedented smooth ride. The power steering, power brakes, and power windows weren't luxuries, they were necessities on a car this large. Under the skin, the 1959 Cadillac was as modern as you could get. The 390 cubic inch V8 engine was a technological marvel. Overhead valves, hydraulic valve lifters, a compression ratio of 10.5 to 1, and enough power to propel this 5,200-pound machine to 60 miles per hour in around 11 seconds. That was genuinely fast for 1959. The Hydromatic transmission, a 4-speed automatic, made driving easier than ever before. But beneath the engineering specs and the design achievements, something more important was happening. The 1959 Cadillac Eldorado, with its towering fins and its chrome-laden surfaces, was the physical embodiment of a particular American moment. It was the visual representation of a culture that had won a great war, had built a prosperous economy, had created a new middle class that had more wealth than any comparable group of people in human history. The 1950s were decades of belief. Americans believed in progress. They believed in the future. They believed that tomorrow would be better than today, that their children would be more successful than they were, that technology would solve all problems and make life easier and more pleasant. Every tail fin, every piece of chrome, every horsepower under the hood was a physical manifestation of that belief. The suburbs were expanding. Young families were buying houses. Highways were being built. The interstate highway system was enacted in 1956 and would transform American life. Cars became the vehicles, literally, through which Americans could explore this new world. You could drive from your suburban home to a drive-in theater, to a shopping center, to a beach resort hours away. The car wasn't just transportation, it was freedom. And the Cadillac, with those impossible fins, was the king of that freedom. To own a Cadillac was to proclaim to the world that you had made it. You had achieved the American dream. You had the money, the status, the confidence to drive the most ostentatious car on the road and not care what anyone thought. The car culture of the 1950s was intimate and public at the same time. Your car was one of the most visible extensions of your identity. The color you chose, the options you selected, the accessories you added, these were statements about who you were and what you valued. The fins themselves were part of this conversation. They announced that you were modern, that you were future-oriented, that you were part of the new America that was being built. The competition between Harley Earl and Virgil Exner produced extraordinary automobiles, but it also produced something else, a benchmark for excellence in automotive design that has never been surpassed. Earl's vision was about restraint within boldness. The fins were extreme, but they were integrated into the overall design. The car didn't look like it was about to fall apart under the weight of its own ornamentation. It looked coherent, unified, intentional. Exner's vision was different. His forward-look designs pushed the boundaries of what was considered possible in automotive styling. By proving that dramatic, sweeping designs could be commercially successful, Exner gave future designers permission to think bigger, to be bolder, to take more risks. Ford, led by designers like Eugene Gregory and Lee Iacocca, who, though primarily known as a marketing executive, had significant influence on Ford's design direction, was finding its own path. Ford's designs were often less extreme than those of GM or Chrysler, but they had their own elegance. The 1955 Ford Thunderbird, with its more restrained lines and its emphasis on balance, proved that you could be modern and stylish without being as extravagant as the Cadillac. But in 1959, there was no question about who had won the tail fin wars. Harley Earl's 1959 Cadillac Eldorado stood alone at the summit of automotive excess. It was the most, the biggest, the tallest, the longest, the flashiest. It was, in many ways, the last car that Harley Earl would directly influence before he retired. And it was magnificent. What no one in Detroit realized in 1959 was that the tail fin era was already drawing to a close. The cultural moment that had produced those towering fins was shifting. A new generation of young people was coming of age, the first generation born during or after World War II, who would come to be known as baby boomers. This generation grew up with the suburbs and the highways and the car culture. But as they came to age in the early 1960s, they began to question the values that had produced their parents' world. There was also a practical problem. Those tall fins, while magnificent to look at, made it harder to see out the back of a car when parking. There were legal liability issues. A pedestrian walking through a parking lot could be injured by a sharp fin if they weren't paying attention. Lawsuits were filed. Courts had to determine whether automakers were responsible for injuries caused by fins. The legal landscape was beginning to shift. Moreover, as the 1960s approached, fuel consumption was beginning to be a concern. Those massive V8 engines, running at 10.5 to 1 compression ratios, were thirsty for gasoline. A 1959 Cadillac Eldorado averaged about 9.5 miles per gallon on the highway. When a gallon of gasoline cost 30 cents, that seemed acceptable. But as the economy shifted and fuel prices began to rise, the automotive industry began to reconsider its approach. By 1960, the fins on new Cadillacs were already being lowered slightly. They were still impressive, but they were no longer pointing straight up. They had begun to slope downward. By 1961, the fins were being reduced further. By the mid-1960s, fins had largely disappeared. In their place came new design languages, the Coke bottle curves of the 1960 Chevrolet Impala, the muscular lines of the Pontiac GTO, the clean simplicity of the 1966 Oldsmobile 442. The tail fin era lasted less than 15 years from its true beginning to its complete end. But in that time, it transformed American automobile design forever. It proved that styling mattered as much as engineering. It showed that emotional appeal could be as important as practical function. It created a benchmark for automotive design that designers would spend decades trying to match, not by recreating the fins, but by recapturing the sense of optimism, ambition, and forward-looking confidence that those fins embodied. That boy who pressed his face against the glass of the diner in 1959, the one who forgot his hamburger while staring at the Cadillac's fins, he grew up. He eventually bought his own car. It didn't have fins. By the time he was old enough to drive, the tail fin era was already fading into history. But he never forgot what he saw that night. When he looks at photographs of 1950s cars now, decades later, he recognizes something in those impossible fins that his children and grandchildren might not quite understand. He sees the moment when America believed everything was possible, when the future seemed inevitable, when a car could look like a spaceship, and it would be beautiful not because it was practical, but because it dared to dream. The 1959 Cadillac Eldorado still exists today. Hundreds of them have been preserved by collectors who understand their significance. They don't serve as reliable transportation anymore. They can't be driven long distances without careful maintenance. They're too heavy, too thirsty for fuel, too impractical for modern roads. But they remain as monuments to a particular moment in American history, a moment when exuberance and excess were paired with genuine engineering achievement, when a car could be both a technological marvel and a work of art, when optimism wasn't naive but justified. Those 45-inch fins reached for the heavens because in 1959 Americans believed they were destined to reach them. And for a brief shining moment, with chrome gleaming and V8 engines roaring, they did.